Good afternoon. My name is Jake Burns. I'm an enterprise strategist here at AWS. Today we're going to talk about migrations. Migrations are still cool, let me assure you, but specifically how to go faster with our migrations. So let me tell you a little bit about why you should listen to me. Why me, right? So I'm part of an interesting and unique group here at AWS called Enterprise Strategy. And we're a team of senior leaders from large organizations who have all led large-scale transformation and cloud adoption using AWS in their prior roles. And so we do a lot of things here at AWS, but perhaps one of the most important things we do is we talk to our customers a lot. So we engage with senior leaders from our largest customers, and we share kind of our firsthand experience having been in their shoes before. And I've been in this role about 6 years, and I've lost count, but well over 1,000 engagements. So on top of my own firsthand experience, having migrated a Fortune 500 company to AWS successfully, I have the privilege of kind of seeing what others are doing out there, what's working and not working in aggregate. And so in this presentation, I'm going to share with you how I did it when I was a customer. And we're going to kind of deviate a little from conventional wisdom and the way most people do it. I'm going to talk about how I see migrations, the best migrations, that do very well, how they are done. And we have a lot of material, and we're going to see if we can do this in 30 or 60 minutes. So in my prior life, I was with Live Nation Ticketmaster, and I led an all-in migration to AWS. This was part of a larger IT modernization that our CEO had mandated. And so going all in with AWS, late 2015, early 2016, was kind of bold. But I was to learn later that I had a 12-month deadline, frozen headcount, no budget. So at the time, it was a bit of an impossible task. But of course, I'm standing here talking to you today, so we were successful, although it did take us 17 months. And we got a lot of benefits out of going to the cloud. We were able to reduce our total cost of ownership for IT by 48%. This is while we were growing an $11 billion business. We reduced our app deployment times to 72 hours, which previously was 6 months. And we reduced we increased our SLA to the business in terms of resiliency from 3 nines to 5 nines. And we eliminated all the performance bottlenecks related to infrastructure in the process. So 6 years later, or almost 10 years later at this point, I'm surprised that this statistic is still accurate, that 85% of IT spend is still on premises. But when I think about all the engagements that I have with customers, and I've had hundreds in the past few years, that are trying to migrate, if I'm honest, I do see a lot of them struggling. So it's not for a lack of wanting to go to the cloud. In my opinion, it's just a lack of great guidance on how to do it well. Because people want to go to the cloud, it's just not everyone succeeding, or succeeding as fast as they want to. So I'm going to go through kind of the high level in the next 60 minutes, the most important things that you need to consider. And it's going to start off kind of basic, but I promise you we'll dive quite deep towards the end. And I'm going to get into very specifics. These aren't just vague ideas. I'll tell you exactly how I did it with the time that we have. And if you have further questions afterwards, hopefully we'll have some time to discuss. So I had a saying when I was a customer, I don't hire cloud engineers, I build them. Now this for me was out of necessity. I couldn't hire anyone, so I was forced to use the people that I had. Now looking back on this was a blessing in disguise, because it forced me to learn how to take regular IT folks and get them bought in to the idea of a transformation and cloud adoption, a new technology, something completely different than what they built their entire careers on, and get them upskilled very quickly and enable them to be successful very quickly. Now these folks became world-class cloud engineers. But I still think even if you have the opportunity to hire new people, your best bet as a leader leading a cloud transformation, or really any transformation, is to focus on your internal team. And I'll explain why. So investing in your employees has several advantages. The first one is they already know each other. They have relationships within the business. People know each other, so you don't have to worry about hiring new people and onboarding them and them learning who everyone is. They understand how to operate within your organization, your bureaucracy, how to get things done, right? And they already work for you. So you have the advantage of not having to go and recruit them. What I've found is that it's far easier to teach cloud skills to your existing employees than it is to teach how your organization works to new hires who may already have cloud skills. So just from a purely self-interested standpoint, as a leader, it makes more sense, it's more efficient to at least give your employees a first shot at it before you go hire new people. Also, if you do this, then your team and the people that work for you will tend to have more of a positive attitude towards the cloud. So a lot of the problems with cloud adoption comes from the technical folks within an organization that have this attitude that I'm engineering myself out of a job, why would I do this? Or maybe a little bit of a discomfort stepping out of their comfort zone. But if you do this, then it kind of helps bring them around. Now, most of the organizations that I work with, they do something quite the opposite. But investing in your own people has its own challenges. Now, what most of the organizations do is they outsource the migration. They look at what are the skills that we're deficient in as an organization, and let's go hire for those skills, or let's go contract some organization to come in and fill the gap. The problem is your employees will see it as a threat. You will end up training these external resources that you bring in on your dime, and then they'll go ahead and leave with that information, and you'll lose it, and hopefully they'll leave behind documentation. And it also rewards short-term thinking, because if you bring in kind of hired guns to do this, and they know they're not going to have to be around to support it, maybe they'll fulfill the requirements, but they wouldn't do as high of a quality job as if they knew they'd have to stick around and run the operations. So here's the first excuse you're going to get from your people is that they're too busy. Now, calling it an excuse is probably being too harsh, because the reality is most people are too busy. When we do cloud migrations and we ask an IT team to go and do this migration, they have a day job, they have obligations, and they have roles and responsibilities. So this is a real, very real, not excuse, but reason or challenge that we need to overcome. Now, the next two things, number 2 and number 3, they're probably not going to tell you, but they're very true. Number 2 is they're fearful. It's natural to fear the unknown. For most people doing cloud migrations, even today, it's their first time doing it. And so it's natural to have doubts as to whether you could do it. And also, at the end of this, what's my job going to look like? Am I going to be able to do my job? And the third is that they may not care, right? So leadership, people who've committed to moving to cloud, adopting cloud, they have a stake in it. But the people that you're asking to bring along with you, the people that work for you, why do they care? We need to solve for that problem as well. Now, the good news is we can use outsourcing to solve these problems. So instead of outsourcing your migration, I advocate for taking the opposite approach. Outsource the undifferentiated work. Your team says they're too busy. Well, what are you too busy doing? And let's outsource that. These are the things that you're not learning, you're not growing, you're just doing the same thing over and over again, and these systems are going away anyway. We're going to replace them with the cloud, or replace them with AI or some new technology. So let's outsource that and free up your time so you can learn cloud and do the migration and invest in you. And bring in experts, but on a very temporary basis. And I suggest really over-communicating this, because when you bring in experts into an organization, it can always be perceived that these are people coming in to replace you. But be very intentional to explain to your team that these people are just to kind of help you, guide you in the first few steps, and then we're going to kick them out. We're going to politely ask them to leave. We're going to take the training wheels off. So the great thing about this approach is that if you pull it off, then the people who build it will be the people who support it. And that's the best case scenario. So we're addressing each one of these problems. They're too busy, so we outsource the undifferentiated work, the boring work. They're fearful, so we give them training, and we bring in experts to guide them in the beginning. And they don't care, so how do we solve for don't care? Well, we have to get what's called buy-in. So what is buy-in? Well, you'll have buy-in when your team, you don't have to ask them to do the work. They want to do the work. At Live Nation, I would come in on the weekends and I would see my team working. And I didn't ask them to come in during that migration. They were really excited because they were bought into it. They understood what was in it for them. They understood why we were doing this, and they believed that we could be successful. So if those things are true and you have buy-in, then you don't have to worry about motivating your team, because they'll be self-motivated. Now, you're going to have stakeholders within your organization even if you have a mandate from the CEO, they could passive-aggressively kind of sabotage things behind the scenes. Like the classic example is never giving you a cutover date approval, right? Just saying, oh, next weekend, right? So on the face value, they're helping you, but they're really not. So we want to get them bought in as well. So here's a 3-step process to get buy-in. First, explain the why. And the why has to be something bigger than because we want to use the cloud, or because we want to use AI, or because we want to save money. tie this to what your business does and how it helps your customers. So for me, this was, we're going to revolutionize the fan experience, and the cloud's going to help us do this. So it makes them proud of the work they're doing, and they see why they're doing this work. I mean, IT folks very rarely get to make those kind of connections. The work I'm doing is directly helping people, our customers. Explain how you're doing it. Share your plan with them. A lot of leaders keep their plan a secret. And if you keep your plan a secret, then people are going to assume the worst. They might assume you don't have a plan, or they might assume that your plan sucks, right? It can't work. So share your plan. Solicit feedback. You don't have to take every piece of feedback and incorporate it into the plan, but at least listen, and if someone has a better idea, incorporate it. That way it becomes our plan, not just my plan. Because like, if I'm an IT guy, that's my boss's plan. It may work or may not work, right? But if it's our plan, we got to make our plan work. So you become more invested in it, and you have the confidence that it can work. And lastly, what's in it for them? And this is super easy with cloud and even with AI. You're going to become, you might have a dead-end job. I had one guy who was a data center operator, one guy who was doing help desk, a bunch of infrastructure people that were managing on-premise infrastructure. Well, we're going to turn you into cloud engineers. You're going to become much more valuable in the marketplace. And at some point, you'll stop asking me, what about our job security? Because you won't care anymore. You're going to have so many options. I'll be fighting to keep you. And if you want to go elsewhere, you'll be worth a lot more money. So what's in it for them? You just have to articulate that. Now, buy-in is needed for multiple areas of the organization. I think from the top, it's useful to have alignment across the whole organization, and from your peers, so that they'll give you the cooperation that you're going to need. And we'll kind of get into this a little bit later. And then, of course, from your team, so that they're bought in. And if you get it from every area of the organization, your life is going to be far, far easier. So 2 things. 1, buy-in is always the first step. Now, most people skip this step. Most people don't even know this step exists. But this is critical. If you don't get buy-in, you can do everything else right. You're very unlikely to succeed with a true transformation of any sort. But you have to do it first, because if you proceed beyond this step and you don't have buy-in, then people will not, they will find ways to undermine your effort. And the second thing to consider here is that buy-in is not consensus. Not everyone has to agree on exactly what we're doing. They just have to understand why we're doing it, see that it could work, and see how it's going to benefit them. The next thing to do is provide training. And training creates familiarity, which alleviates fear. So a lot of people, probably with cloud, it's not so much the case today, but back when I was doing it, they didn't know what a VPC was. They didn't know what a landing zone was. They didn't know what all these terms were, so they were afraid to even talk about it. They didn't want to sound stupid. So just knowing the concepts and knowing the words and knowing what they mean, knowing the definitions, helps a lot. And I advise allowing everyone in the organization to take the initial training. You'll see very quickly who's engaged, and those people who are engaged, those are the ones you give more and more training to. And you create a meritocracy that way. I also suggest including leadership in training. So this has multiple advantages. One is it creates what's called cloud fluency. So obviously we don't expect the CIO to be a certified professional architect, right? But for them to understand kind of what the words mean so that they can understand what's going on, also they see their leadership in the training, and it creates a sense of teamwork. I saw this at Live Nation. We all took the training together. Now, everyone was getting something else out of it than everyone else, but we were all in this together. They saw we were taking this seriously. Leadership is taking this seriously. They're in the training right here with us. And it allows you to keep your leaders accountable, because you can't realistically hold people accountable for things they don't understand. So you don't want people to just claim ignorance. Now, this is really important, how to make training stick. Most people mess this up. So get buy-in before training, right? Because if you send people to training before you have buy-in, then it's just like, honestly, a paid vacation. Why should they care enough to learn these things? Second is they need to know going into it that they're going to drive. I have a joke that I tell, if you want to kill morale in an organization, send everyone to training, and then immediately afterwards, outsource your migration. This really upsets people, as you can imagine. So make sure that they understand they're going to drive, so they'll pay attention. They're like, I need to learn this because I'm going to have to do this. And then immediately put it into practice. I had a 12-month deadline, and so we actually had to do the training and the migration at the same time. Now, I know not everyone can pull that off, but the next best thing is to start your migration immediately after the training. Because every day that goes by that you're not putting it into practice, you're going to lose some of it. And so get the most out of your training by putting it into practice as soon as possible. All right, now we're going to start talking about ways in which I deviate very greatly from standard guidance that's given out there. So I see three kind of cohorts when it comes to a cloud migration with the way that I advocate doing it. First is the cloud team. In my case, this was formerly the IT infrastructure team. We renamed it Cloud Services. But in essence, these are the people who work for you who are going to actually do the migration. These are people who are accountable for it. These are people who are going to do all the heavy lifting. They're going to take all the training. They're going to have to become experts. The leader of the cloud team has ultimate accountability for this. The buck stops with that person. Now, I put CCOE in quotes here because this isn't a standard cloud center of excellence. But I see a lot of customers spending a lot of time putting together committees, Cloud Center of Excellence, Cloud Enablement Engine, Cloud Business Office, Cloud Leadership Team. I mean, there's so many flavors of it now, right? None of that is actually moving the ball forward. Now, I could see the merit in some of those, but my suggestion is to make it as lean as possible, make it as informal as possible, spend as little time as possible forming these committees, and make it just head of InfoSec, head of HR, head of finance, and the cloud team leader. And that way, we're all clear on budgets, security policies, and roles and responsibilities, and meet as often as you need to, but doesn't have to be like a twice-a-week cadence or anything like that. And then lastly, the stakeholders. Everyone else is a stakeholder. So these are a named person. You have to have a person's name to put on it. And this is typically an IT application owner for each application that you're going to migrate. This is the person, and for this group of people, we're going to ask very little of them. So the trend here is we want to ask for as little as possible and deliver as much as possible. And that's how we're going to be successful here. So for them, all we're asking is you're going to give us approval on the architecture that we design. You're going to provide someone to do the QA testing when we do cutover. And you're going to give us the approval once we cut over. And that's it. And really, everything is going to go super smooth because, as you'll see when we get into more detail, we're going to make very few changes in the migration phase. We're going to keep things pretty similar to how they are on-prem with some very, very small changes. And so you should really notice nothing, except maybe it'll be a little faster, hopefully. All right, so a little bit more on the cloud team. It's natural in the beginning, especially, for there to be early adopters and for there to be laggards, right? There's going to be people who are ready to do this, enthusiastic about doing this, and there's going to be others who maybe need a little bit more time. And so this actually works in our favor because we need people to keep the lights on, right, and run interference and run all those projects that we haven't outsourced that we need people to do. So cloud operations was that for me. So you guys can manage the on-prem infrastructure while the architects, the engineers are migrating to cloud. And you need at least one PM. Now, recommend having tenants. Here are some good ones you can start with. We encourage everyone to join the cloud team if they meet the requirements. So anyone within IT or maybe even your entire company, allow them to join the team because what you want to index for is enthusiasm and willingness to learn more so than current knowledge. In my experience, the willingness to learn is a much more greater indicator of success when it comes to these kinds of things. So anyone can join as long as they meet the requirements. Now, positions within the team are determined by the requirements, not by existing seniority. And the requirements are agreed upon by the team. So the cloud team makes these requirements for each position within the team, and they live with them. That way, no one could complain that it's unfair, right? And these tenets and the rules and the requirements can evolve over time. And this is important. The senior members of the team, one of their primary responsibilities is to mentor the new members and the junior members of the team because we're creating this virtuous circle where it's going to be a few people in the beginning and then more and more people are going to join, and we want to be kind of a self-sustaining organism, so to speak, right? So what this does is it creates a meritocracy, and that increased performance and increases morale, which also feeds back into increasing performance. And when you combine those two things, that's where consistent high performance comes from. All right, it's going to get incrementally more controversial. So landing zones. My position here is it should take you days, not weeks or years. And yes, I've seen landing zones take years. I think a lot of this comes from people not knowing what a landing zone is, and so they just kind of want to put everything into it. And when you're building your landing zone, you're not migrating anything. So if you're taking years or months to build a landing zone, this is just delaying your migration. So we want to get through this process as quickly as possible. Here are the primary things. I know you can add many more things to a landing zone, but here are just for people who are not familiar with the landing zone, you can have a root account, which is an AWS account. You click a button, you create an account, right? You're gonna have multiple other accounts that your applications are gonna live in that roll up into that account. You're gonna have network connectivity, which is gonna be an AWS Direct Connect or VPN or both, hopefully both. You're gonna have VPCs or virtual private clouds, which are just an abstraction layer for your subnets and your networking that you're gonna put in there. And then you're gonna have access control, IAM. So this is connected to your AD, connected to Okta, or create user accounts within AWS. It could be this simple, and that really can take you a few hours if you wanted to do it in a very lean way. If you wanted to take your time, I think a week is reasonable. So I think the cloud team should build this. Don't outsource this, please, because this is good practice, right? The cloud team is gonna migrate things. Why not let them build a landing zone where all the applications are gonna live? That way they'll be familiar with it, right? They can build on that knowledge. The AWS Solutions Architect track, that training is fantastic. It tells you everything you need to know in order to build that. That's what we used, and we were able to do it at a very high level. And AWS Solutions Architects are a free resource you can bring in to either assist in doing this or validate that it's done properly. So I certainly recommend you do one of those. The point is, do it in a secure and resilient way, but do it quickly and move on. Okay, infrastructure as code is another topic that people argue. I think there are legitimate pros and cons. I'm gonna go through this very quickly. The advantages are that it's self-documenting. So it's like you wouldn't build a house without having blueprints. I think you shouldn't build cloud infrastructure without having it defined, right? Blueprints for your infrastructure. So, you can check this infrastructure as code into a repository and have a copy of that and know kind of at all times, as long as you're being disciplined with it, what your infrastructure looks like. It creates consistency across environments. So a common problem in almost all IT shops is that dev and test and UAT, they're all completely inconsistent. So you do your testing in the test environment, and then you put it into prod, and it doesn't work. Why? Because test and prod environments are not consistent. If you use infrastructure as code, you could take that code snippet, like CloudFormation, for example, with some minor changes, redeploy that in another environment and create your dev environment. Or you can do it vice versa. So you can create consistency across environments. You could use it also for DR. So if you think about it, if you build all of your infrastructure with infrastructure as code, and you take that infrastructure as code, put on a thumb drive and put it in a safe. If you have a copy of your data as well, you can theoretically recreate everything in your environment. So that's kind of a nice safety net to have. You can also take those CloudFormation templates, for example, and I know there's different IOC technologies out there, but I'm just using CloudFormation as an example. You could take that, and with some minor modifications, you could pop up your entire infrastructure in another region. Of course, you have to replicate your data, but you can have an exact copy of everything. And that's a great way to do DR. Version control, right? Developers have been doing this forever. Why can't infrastructure folks have the same advantage? So you can check it out. You can have different versions. Imagine if you had a version of your infrastructure that corresponds to a version of your code, and you could say these two go together, right? And then you don't have to worry about your infrastructure drift as much anymore. And finally, reusable components. This is probably my favorite, because you're gonna have junior members on the team. They're not gonna be able to write infrastructure as code in the beginning, but what they can do is they can take snippets of existing infrastructure as code that your more senior engineers have built and mix and match them like Lego blocks. And I've seen this done, and it's amazing, and it allows everyone to be productive. But even your more senior engineers are gonna do that as well. Why reinvent the wheel? So as you go, you'll build up a library of infrastructure code components that are blessed and hopefully get better over time, and then reuse those things, and you get these building blocks that are unique to your organization and work, and you don't have to go through the trouble of doing it. Okay, so the disadvantages. So it isn't without disadvantages. First, there's a learning curve, right? Infrastructure people, we did ourselves a disservice calling it infrastructure as code, because they hear the word code and they're like, I'm not a coder, right? But it's structured data. It's really not as intimidating as it looks like. But there is a learning curve, so it's good to acknowledge that they're gonna have to learn it. And it requires discipline. And the reason I say this is because you're almost better off not using it at all if you're gonna do infrastructure code as code for some things and manual non-infrastructure as code for other things, because you're gonna get drift. So this is probably the hardest part, is like having that discipline to when you're gonna make a change, you don't just click a button in the console or run a command on the CLI, you actually change the code and redeploy the code. If you can do that, if you can have that discipline, you will have all of these advantages. But if you don't, then you'll run into trouble. So that's something just good to remember. Okay, HA and DR, real quick. Everyone probably already knows, if you're running EC2-based instances, spread them across AZs, right? So that's just common sense. Now here's something that not many people will tell you. For some SLAs, you may need to span more than AZs. You may need to span regions. Like if you have something that needs 7 nines or 8 nines, or the big boss says 100% uptime is our requirement, right? Even though that doesn't exist, you have to span multiple regions, unfortunately, to do that. That should be super rare. Multi-AZ should meet the SLA requirements most of the time, but some of the time you are going to span multiple regions. And the good news is if you replace EC2-based instances with AWS native services like Lambda and things like that, then you get multi-AZ HA built in. Okay, DR in the cloud. So replicate your data. Don't replicate the whole environment. I think probably everyone in this room probably already knows this, but I've seen this happen. People, they do DR in a certain way in the data center, and they say, we're going to do it the same way in the cloud. It's a big waste of money. Replicate the data, keep the instances powered off. If you want to kind of have a compromise, then do what's called pilot light, where you have a very, very small instance that can scale up on demand. But if you're just running things in your DR environment all the time, 24/7, then you're just throwing money away, in my opinion. And active-active multi-region DR, I hear this sometimes from customers, unless you're Netflix or NASA or something like that, probably question that requirement, because that can bring a lot of complexity, can have a lot of benefits, but a lot of complexity, and a lot of people who think they need it actually don't really understand what it is. So just keep that in mind. And then again, one more thing that most people will never say, disaster recovery for the cloud. So you want to have a copy of your data that is in a completely separate place than your production data, with a completely different set of access controls than your production data. Because you can think about, if you're taking backups in the cloud and the same team has access to production data and backup data, you can see where the problems may come. So this is a conversation all of itself, but it's just something that people don't think about. There are solutions to this, and there are cloud-native solutions to this, but it's something you should consider so you don't put yourself in a dangerous situation unknowingly. All right, so some just last best practices before we get into the fun stuff. Use multiple accounts. I don't think this is controversial anymore. There was a time way back in the day where we had arguments like one big account for everything versus an account for every application. I think the account for every application people won. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be for every application, but you could do it by BU, by business unit. So like everyone in this department gets their own account, everyone on this team gets their own account. It has so many benefits. First of all, it simplifies IAM. So anyone who's ever written an IAM policy knows there's a very steep learning curve on that. It's a skill in and of itself. But if you have one application and one account, you can give admin to the admin of that application, to that whole account, not worry about your IAM policies. So yes, I'm shaking their head. There are pros and cons to this approach, but you could still have IAM access controls, but it can greatly simplify it, because if you have everything in one account and you're mixing and matching everyone, you better get every single IAM policy perfect, because it's one fat finger away from a big problem. So we could talk about this afterwards. It limits your blast radius. So if something does happen, then it will contain it to a certain extent, right? Mitigate service limits, which is, I hated service limits when I was a customer. You try to go deploy a new resource, and it's like you've reached your service limit. You have to call a number, right? So if you have more accounts, then you will have, you'll hit those service limits less frequently. And it makes cost transparency easy. So what I did is a cheat code, because people love using tagging to do cost chargebacks and all that. You could do that, but those tags better be correct, right? People will dispute it within your organization, and they probably won't be correct all the time. But if you put every, say, budget owner, give them their own account, then in Cost Explorer, you could go in there and you will see undisputable what they cost. Now, there are certain charges that won't get captured that way, that you're still gonna have to do a peanut butter spread, but you can get, I'd say, 95% of it by doing it that way. The other thing is documentation. We all know documentation will always be out of date. So my idea is make it part of your workflow. As you migrate, make it impossible not to document, and we'll talk about how we do that. And use something simple. I like Wiki. You could use your favorite tool of choice, but something lightweight is good. And then tagging. Okay, required tags can be useful. I think people over-rely on them, but they can be useful. Just remember, if you don't have a forcing function for your required tags, they're not required. They're optional. even though you say they're required. So you have to have a forcing function like, hey, if it doesn't have a tag that says prod, then it might get shut down at any moment. Then people will put that required tag in if you have a forcing function like that. Okay. Oh, assessment and inventory are two boring words, but I promise you this section's not as boring as it sounds. I think your assessment should take almost no time. It should be very quick. We want to get to migrating as soon as possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our, basically our inventory, right? Everybody has an inventory of the applications and infrastructure. When I talk to most CIOs, they say, yeah, I have 7 different ones, right? Okay, so the exercise is to consolidate them. Best level of effort. Doesn't have to be perfect, right? Let's just do our best level. It will be perfect by the end of the migration, but it'll never be perfect before that. So let's identify all the applications and scope for the migration. Identify an owner for each application. Map the infrastructure to the application, so you know what infrastructure each application is using. Map application dependencies. Now, this isn't as big of a deal as most people make it out to be, but sometimes some things have to be moved together. Order the application cutovers by stakeholder support, migration difficulty, and business criticality. I'm going to get into dive a little deeper on why we want to do this and how to do this in a second. And then we create strawman cutover dates. So we're going to put in guesses. So remember, we're consolidating existing data. We're not starting from scratch. This shouldn't be some huge effort. Take what you have. This is our best guess. Time box it. Maybe make it, say, a week max. We're going to do this, and we're going to work with what we have. We're just trying to create something useful enough to get started. All right, so this is what it looks like. My super small migration with, 11 applications for sake of example. So here are applications. Here are the owners, right? I'm just putting first names in here, but obviously put their full name when you do it. So this is the stakeholder, right? So it might be us, it might be IT. If IT is running it, we're going to also move our own applications. But we have to have application owners for the other ones. People who have the authority to say, yes, we can migrate this. The infrastructure, these servers, these storage arrays, this is what these applications depend on. And then cutover groups, right? These ERP, audit, and BPC have to be moved together for whatever reason. So we're going to bunch those together, and then we're going to order them. And again, we're ordering by the easiest stuff at the top, the least business critical at the top, and the strongest stakeholder support at the top. We want to make it really easy in the beginning. We're going to put mock cutover dates. We can be confident of 2 dates. When we're going to start and when we're going to stop, when we're going to be done. Because we're going to set a deadline. We have to have a deadline. So those are our 2 dates. The rest are guesses, and we'll fill them in as we go. All right, so let's talk about momentum real quick. Why do we rank order by stakeholder support, migration difficulty, and business criticality? Why do we do it in that order? Well, the reason is this is what most migrations look like. Now, I think we have a false sense of what migrations look like because we hear about the stories after they're done, and people tend to rewrite history. So you talk to a customer that migrated, and you'll find out that everyone there was helped plan it. Everyone there was in favor of it in the beginning, and it was just such a happy story. But those of us who've lived through it know that that's rarely the case. Usually in the beginning of any transformation, and we're going through this again with AI, is that somebody wants to get this done, and everyone else in the organization wants to maintain the status quo. So you'd be kind of like a lone person there. So when your results are low, your opposition tends to be high. Now, as you go, and as you keep winning, as long as you keep winning, people will come around, and you'll get this inflection point where momentum's on your side, everyone jumps on the bandwagon. Now, this tends to happen after you needed their help, so it's not so helpful, but this is just the way of things, unfortunately. So the question then becomes, how do we jumpstart this process, right? Because we know if we could just get the momentum going, we'll get all the support we need from people, but how do we get that? So the way we do that is we start small, and we build a series of wins. So I'm going to migrate that one website server, and then I'm going to count that as 1. And I'm going to send out an email to everyone, or one of 120 is done, right? Maybe even throw a little party, right? We're going to do that over and over and over again with the easy, non-critical stuff. And by the time we get to the really difficult stuff, by the time we get to our ERP system and all of these things where the vendor says we can't do it and all these other things, we'll have so much support internally that if we make a mistake, they'll forgive us. But in the beginning, they probably wouldn't. And the great thing is, by the time we get to that point, our team will be so skillful because they'll have all this practice on the easier stuff that they'll probably be able to pull it off also. So it tends to work out. You'll get all the support after you need it, right? Okay, so this was our mantra. Go faster than what's comfortable. Where did I get this from? Well, it's what our CEO said to us. It's never a good sign when your CEO tells IT, go faster than you're comfortable with. It means you're going too slow. We were going too slow. And moving to the cloud allows us to go a lot faster. So this is my assertion. You're more likely to fail from too few constraints than from too many. The migrations that I see fail, they have, we're going to create a 2-year plan to create a 5-year migration plan, things like that, right? They have a lot of time to kind of waste and a lot of money to waste. These really big budgets can work against you sometimes. So if you're familiar with Parkinson's law, it states that work fills to take up the time needed for its completion, right? It's why if we're given a homework assignment in college and it's due a week from now, I don't know, maybe some of you are more disciplined than me, but I'm usually starting the night before. Means only took a day, really, right? So why did we give a whole week? The whole week was, 6 of those days were spent doing something else. And so now you could take this too far, right? But most of us don't. Most of us give way too much time. They give too much resources, and it causes more problems than it solves for. So one of the problems is a lack of urgency. And if you have all the time in the world, you can stall and you can work on that perfect plan that you're going to throw at anyway, because when you start doing it, you're going to really figure out how to do it, and that plan's going to be outdated. So just get started now. A lot of people never get started because they have a lack of urgency. They have a lack of focus. They spend major time on minor things. They spend months or years setting up landing zones. They set up all these committees around the organization that are not migrating because they have all the time in the world. Or they have huge budgets, so they go find all these really expensive tools to buy. And still, not a single application has been migrated. And so having that focus, right? So if you have 100 things to do, which ones are you going to choose? Human nature says that we're going to choose the easiest ones first, usually, or the ones we want to do. But if you only have time to do 10 of them, which one are you going to do? You're going to do the ones that are going to move the ball forward, right? So that constraint creates that focus to make you focus on the most important things. And a lack of innovation, right? Because if you have all the resources you've always had, you're going to keep doing things the way you've always done them. So we want to utilize constraints. In my case, a deadline forced me to begin before I felt ready. If I waited until I felt ready, I never would have got started, most likely, right? So if this is your first time doing something, you're never going to feel ready. You get ready by doing. Makes you focus on what matters. Makes you work backwards from a goal. This was easy for me. So 12 months from now, we're out of the data center, and I'll just work backwards from that. There's no other way to plan for something like that, right? Budget forces you to become lean, forces you to invent and simplify, and to innovate, come up with new ways of doing things. Again, I didn't have, the guidance that was given to me, I didn't have the budget to buy those tools and to do those things, so I had to find a new way, and some of those ways ended up being better. And limited headcount, it forced me to motivate my existing team. It forced me to learn how to upskill team, forced me to learn how to build cloud engineers, right? Not just hire them, and create the talent that I needed. And that becomes a superpower if you can develop that muscle. Okay, probably the most controversial part of the whole thing. I am not a fan of the 7 Rs. Let me explain why. There might be 1 or 2 people in here who can define all of these. I sure couldn't, so I had to look them up. It turns out a refactor is a full refactor. So we're going to refactor the entire application, modernize it, and we move to cloud. Okay. Replatform is a partial refactor. So we're going to make some changes. Repurchase means we're not migrating. We're going to replace it with SaaS. Rehost is lift and shift, okay? I don't think a lift and shift really exists, but I'll explain why in a second. Relocate is also a lift and shift, but from a hypervisor, so we get an extra R for that one. Retain is we're just going to keep it on premise. We're not going to migrate. So that's out of scope, right? Retire, we're not going to migrate. We're going to decommission. So here's my opinion on this, right? Lift and shift is a myth. You can't take your existing servers and put it on a forklift and ship it to AWS and have it run there. There's always going to be some changes necessary, right? Even if however small, unless, in order to do it safely, let's put it that way. So some very minor changes are necessary. So the pure lift and shift doesn't really exist in my opinion. The 7 Rs exercise attempts to answer two questions at once. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I don't think it does a very good job of it. What are we migrating, and how much refactoring are we doing? See, the problem is that the 7 Rs, it gives us only a couple choices of how much refactoring we're going to do. We're going to do a full refactor, a partial refactor, which is pretty ambiguous, or a lift and shift, which I don't think exists. So it's really imprecise. And it adds additional complexity and upfront work for most customers. I see a lot of customers get stuck on this beginning step, and I think you could just skip it. But of course, you got to replace it with something else. So if we look at all these Rs, they really fall into two categories. One is we're migrating, and we're going to do some refactoring in each one of these. But we shouldn't fit it into some arbitrary box, right? So we're either going to migrate or we're not going to migrate. So let's define what's in scope, what's out of scope, and then for each application, let's just decide what's the right amount of refactoring to do. We could do this iteratively. None of these decisions have to be made up front. This doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out exercise. So let's look at the alternative. I call it minimal viable refactoring. So it's iterative, flexible, fast, safe, and simple. We start with the lift and shift. So we say, if we tried to lift and shift this, what would it look like? Now, then we have what I call the Hippocratic Oath of IT. First, do no harm. Now, if we were to migrate, lift and shift this, what would get worse? You could pick your categories that you care about, but most customers care about security compliance, reliability, performance, and cost. That's what I cared about. So how can we do the minimal amount of refactoring during the migration to make none of those worse? And this is the hard part for engineers. Not do any more refactoring than that, because we're going to find things that we can make better, but we don't want to overcomplicate the migration process and jeopardize the migration by getting distracted with all of these things that actually do need to be done, but we're far better off doing them once we're in the cloud. So the idea here is to get to the cloud as quickly and safely as possible, and then do the refactoring once we're in the cloud, once we have access to all the AWS services, and once we're free of all the constraints of the data center, and once we're free from this massive migration project. So we can focus on the migration, and we can focus on the refactoring. Okay, so here we go, the meat. This is what happens when you allow an engineer to design a migration process. But I think it works quite well. So we're going to take all of our applications, and we have these rank ordered by least difficult, least critical, most stakeholder support, and then go down to more difficult stuff. And that's going to funnel into the first process, which is called scoping. And this is where the project manager steps in. The project manager is going to assign or identify an app owner, a QA tester that the app owner will probably nominate, make sure that we've documented the infrastructure that's needed and the dependencies. And the project manager is going to document all of this in the wiki. We're going to project plan through the wiki. Now, you can use anything. You don't have to use a wiki, but we used a wiki. Then it's going to go off to a cloud engineer who's going to do architecture design. The architecture engineer is going to do minimal viable refactor. They're going to say, start with the lift and shift, and what are the fewest changes we can make to not make anything worse and run this in AWS. And that should be very few things. They're going to diagram it. They're going to run a cost estimate, and you can use the AWS cost tool, which is pretty reasonably accurate. It's not 100% accurate, but you can get a good ballpark figure of what the cost will be. Determine ACLs, firewall rules, and so forth, and figure out what account it's going to be destined to go in, and then document that in the wiki. Then it's going to go over to architecture approval. So in the architecture approval stage, the leader of the cloud team, leader of InfoSec, and the application owner will all give their approvals. They'll say, this looks good. Everyone's happy with this. Okay, it's approved. Now, the cloud engineer will build it in AWS using infrastructure as code, hopefully, and simultaneously start the data transfer. Now, data transfer, in a lot of cases, can be the bottleneck. So you want to start that data transfer as quickly as possible. There are great third-party vendors that can help accelerate this. So ask me how, after this, I can make an introduction. Once that's done, the system is built and it's deployed. The data is in AWS. The application owner will do their pre-cutover testing. So let's just make sure everything works. It should work because we made very few changes. Then it'll be scheduled for cutover. Cloud engineer will cut it over during the cutover. The app owner will do final cutover testing and approval, and then we're live. So this is what it looks like in practice. How do we make this go as fast as possible? All right, so we start sequencing things through monitoring. We're eating our own dog food, right? So we're doing the IT applications first. Goes up scoping, goes into architecture design, then email moves up into scoping, and so forth. And then things move through this process, right? And they just keep moving through this process. Monitoring goes live, and then invariably something gets blocked, right? Because we live in an imperfect world. So in this example, the file servers got blocked waiting for architecture approval. For whatever reason, we couldn't get that approval. Maybe they didn't like how we designed it. Maybe the person was on vacation. Things happen, right? So instead of letting this thing come to a grinding halt, what we're going to do is we're going to do what a software engineer would do. We're going to identify all the areas where this process can get blocked, and it's these 5 areas in this particular flavor of the process, and we're going to create a queue. We're going to let stuff queue up while it's waiting, so everything else can flow and route around the problem. And in this way, we make a non-blocking, multi-threaded process. So what ends up happening is the file server can stay blocked, but everything else keeps moving through. And we're going to keep waiting for that approval for the file server, but everything else is going to keep moving until the file server gets unblocked, gets sequenced right back in, and we keep going. And so this is a very simple example of the process, but in reality, you're going to have stuff blocked all over the place, and you're going to be tracking it all through a wiki or whatever your platform of choice is, and you're just going to keep things moving. And the idea here is we want to get everybody should be busy all of the time. Nobody should be waiting for anything. Just like a good piece of code, like a good software design. Nothing is just blocked, and then the end user is sitting there with a frozen screen, right? Things just keep flowing around the problem while you resolve the problem. And in that way, you can go very quickly. So here are the key ingredients that we talked through in here. You get your people bought in. You've outsourced to free up their time. You've given the cloud team training and certifications, which I highly, highly recommend. Can't praise AWS training program enough. They're very, very sharp people. You got your cloud team built, so maybe just rename the infrastructure team, or maybe you built a whole new team based on volunteers, on people who are ready to do it. You've created your quote-unquote CCOE, something very lightweight, very quick. You have your stakeholders identified, and they're bought in as well. Everyone's on the same page. Built your landing zone very quickly. You created your tagging policy. If you have required tags, you have forcing functions for them. You began building your infrastructure as code templates, if you decide to use infrastructure as code, which I encourage you to do if you have the capability. I think the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, but it's a bona fide choice that you can make. If you do choose to use it, you start building a template of reusable components. You did your assessment, you created your inventory very quickly based on the existing sources of truth that you have. And you turn that into your migration plan. So there wasn't this long planning process. You just took your inventory, you rank ordered it, you added a few fields, you put cutover dates on it. There's your plan. You sequenced it so that you can do the easy, least critical things first. So you could build that momentum and get support within the organization and build confidence on your team. And then for your migration, you set a challenging deadline. You embraced constraints. You simplified and accelerated migration with minimal viable refactoring. So you're not doing upfront assessments for anything. You're doing it in a very iterative fashion, and you're doing just the right amount of refactoring for each application that's needed. And then you rapidly migrated using a non-blocking multi-thread process. So just some closing thoughts here, principles. In general, I found that fast works better than slow. And the way you go fast is you remove complexity. Most migrations have far too much complexity, and it's self-inflicted complexity. It doesn't have to be slow, it doesn't have to be expensive, and it doesn't have to be complex. Go back to first principles and think about what are we doing here. We're moving servers to the cloud, right? This is not, no offense to migration experts, I consider myself one of them, that's not rocket science. There is legitimate rocket science out there that's way harder than this. So we don't have to make it harder than it actually is. Migration principles are similar regardless of industry. Now, this is something I've learned. I mean, I already knew this, but I learned that there was this kind of bias in this role, because I'll talk to somebody from the energy sector, like a CIO of an energy company, and they'll say, I'll tell my story, and they'll say, that's all well and good, but media and entertainment's easy. Energy, we have big problems. We're unique, right? You can't just, well, from my perspective, if you're moving servers to cloud, Corp IT is Corp IT. Now, you can have exotic workloads that are outliers, that are special, but for the most part, you can move your IT infrastructure to AWS, regardless of what industry you're in. I believe this works across all industries, and I'm planning on proving it across industries, so that objection no longer exists. If your migration methodology is scalable, it'll work at any scale. So that's another objection I get. They say, well, it worked for you, but our business is 5 times bigger. Well, this methodology, I hope you could kind of see, it's a scalable mechanism. It'll work for if you have 2 workloads, it'll work if you have 2,000 workloads. I think it'll work if you have 200,000 workloads. And if not, let's optimize it. Let's make it better, right? But the key is to make something scalable, so the scale of what you're working with doesn't matter. It can adapt to fit whatever your needs are. Now, there is one requirement in all of this, and it's a hard requirement, that you have a strong leader. Now, hopefully you have many strong leaders within your organization, but I think this can work. I strongly suspect and believe this can work if you only have one. And it needs to be the leader of the cloud team. And the reason is because that's the person who has ultimate accountability, and that's the person who's doing the most work and has to make all of this work. You're asking very little from everyone else in the organization. I put them in the category of stakeholders. We're going to ask very little of them, almost nothing, and we're going to deliver to them their application in the cloud and all the benefits that come with that. And so if you have a strong leader who can sell that to the rest of the organization and can manage that, I think that's probably enough. Constraints are a forcing function for innovation, so we need to embrace constraints. I know this is a tough thing to hear if you're a budget owner, like you should have less budget. Well, maybe not. Maybe you should have a bigger budget, but you should spend it on other things. But make an unreasonable deadline. People, I was always telling my team, nobody thinks we can do this. You know what that did? It made them want to do it, right? If you make it too easy, smart people get bored, is just the bottom line, right? So you have smart people working for you probably, and so set a high bar, set a challenge. And you know what? You can miss the mark like I did and still get great results. That's a very common pattern that I see. Employees that are bought in and supported can achieve anything. I firmly believe this. I really had nothing except my own team. Again, I think you should use outside help in very specific ways, right, to empower your team. But even if all you have is your team and you have nobody else and no support from outside, can't hire anyone new, can't use a partner, it could still work if your employees are bought in and are motivated and want to do it, and you give them what they need to do it. But on the other hand, employees that aren't, they can sabotage anything, and I've seen this as well. So if you ignore your employees and you make it a threat to them, no matter what you do, I very much doubt that you're going to have the success you're looking for. This is the make it or break it, in my opinion. And lastly, I believe anyone can do this, but only if they want to do it. Thank you.